So chapter 6 is memory, okay? Your textbook defines memory as an active system that receives information from the senses, organizes and alters that information as it is stored away, and then retrieves it from storage. As usual, it gets the prize for wordy definitions, but you need to see it. I prefer a much shorter definition, which is the process by which information is encoded, stored, and retrieved. So memory, part of it is putting things into memory such that they are stored for the desired period of time, and then bringing it back so you can actually look at it. Okay, it's like putting a book in the library, you got to pick it out and look at it. For your exam, hopefully you are we just talked about learning in chapter 5. Memory is the system by which the products of learning are stored for future use. Okay. You have to keep them, and that future use is you have to bring them back and use them. Okay, does that make sense? Now we intuitively know what memory is, I know, but we're going to learn a lot of specifics about how cognitive psychology talks about memory. Both learning and memory are aspects of neural and behavioral plasticity, which means the ability to change. Remember your definition of learning, it'll be handy for doing the exam. Any relatively permanent change in behavior brought about by experience or practice. Okay. Learning requires neuroplasticity. Remember we talked about how the brain actually changes when you learn things, right? When you learn them and encode that memory of that learned material in your brain, that's a physical change in your brain. That's memory, the process by which those things are stored. So to distinguish the two from the American Psychological Association, learning is the acquisition of skill or knowledge, while memory is the expression of what we acquire. Okay? So learning is that laborious effort to gain knowledge. Okay? And then memory is that actual moment when it occurs, and then of course the retrieval and bringing it to use later. So we're going to start our chapter with talking about memory processes, a little bit about models of memory. And then we're going to read encoding and forgetting, which is the most fun part for next week. But as my first class found, I forgot to leave a discussion question in here, so we're going to have to get up at some point, but not yet. So memory processes, these are actually the terminology we need to know. Encoding. It's just that conversion of sensory information into a form, you know, into a way to store it in your long-term memory. Storage is what it sounds like, holding on to information for a period of time. And retrieval is getting information that is in storage to a form that can be used. So you can think of it like computers, and as we'll see in a moment, a lot of our theories about memory have a lot of parallels in computing. This is partly because just when the cognitive revolution in psychology was happening, so 1950s and 70s, they were there was a thinking, well, maybe we could study the darkness behind the eyes. At the same time that was happening in psychology, computers were happening, right? The first huge, gigantic mainframe. So this is all like right there, what was happening at the time in science. So you can think of encoding is how things are doing in the computer might be stored in zeros and ones, right? So all the information that you're putting in, typing in, somehow putting in the computer is stored in zeros and ones. It's held in specific places for in the computer a long time, actually in your brain too, with the problem retrieving it. And retrieval, we bring out convert those zeros and ones into a Word document or into whatever we're looking at, right? And retrieval is bringing it into consciousness, so put it down, or performing an action. So procedural memory, which is like riding a bike, we'll see a little bit about that in a minute. It's just doing it. That is also memory retrieval, performing an action. So where in the brain do memory live? Pavlov, I think I mentioned this the other day, just thought that it was just a strengthening of the connection between the conditioned stimulus where that lay and the unconditioned stimulus center. Okay. Carl Lashley, and just in the first half of the 20th century, he really thought there was going to be some kind of physical place in the brain, specific place. And he looked for that by training rats in mazes. Remember we saw rat mazes last week? But he trained them to navigate a maze, and then he would cut or remove little bits of their brain. And then have them do the brain their maze again. Okay? He didn't find any place in the brain that could cut or remove and make them unable to perform the maze. They kept being able to perform the maze. When they couldn't, when there was some effect, it was because of the size. So the more of the brain he harmed, the worse it was made, but he just found no things out, right? So he then worked on some other theories for where things might be stored. One was equipotentiality, and this is the idea that all parts of the cortex, or the outer part of the brain, chapter 2, contributes equally to learning and memory. In line with that, he proposed a theory of mass action. That the cortex works as a whole, and the more the better, the more that you're using. Okay, these are both wrong. Okay, they're based on erroneous assumptions about how the brain works. We now know, of course, and we'll see that in a minute, that memory consolidation occurs or learning starts in the cerebellum. Memory consolidation for semantic memory is the hippocampus is essential. We saw in that video of HM, right? But they were good ideas. Like I was saying, the cerebellum is very important. Specifically, the lateral interprocessus nucleus is involved in learning, in the original acquisition of information. And then various parts of your brain are necessary for consolidation. So the consolidation just refers to the changes that take place in the structure, physical structure, and functioning of neurons when a memory is formed. Connection. We know now that the hippocampus is necessary for the formation of long-term memory. Okay, so we saw the video about that HM. He had part of his brain, his hippocampus removed. And he could no longer form new memories, which is called anterograde amnesia. Amnesia for things that happened before the drama or trauma. Retrograde amnesia. Anterograde just means you can't form new memories, and that happened to HM. And that's how we know that the hippocampus is essential for forming memories. Okay, so consolidation, we just covered this. An important part of consolidation, long-term potentiation. Changes in the number and sensitivity of receptor sites and synapses through repeated stimulation. So that's part of consolidation. And it's not like there's a specific photoselectors that the connections between areas of the brain are strengthened or weakened according to learning. So for example, children, and I think we'll talk about this in so babies are born with all sorts of stuff going on, with many connections in their brain, many pathways. And then over the first, I don't know how many years, I'm going to say 9 years, some of those collective pruning goes on. And a lot of those connections and pathways in their brain, because they're not used, are lost. They wither and die away. Other connections and pathways are strengthened. So for example, a baby born in China and learning Mandarin is going to have some pathways really strengthened because their language is tonal, etc., that he would be like babies born in the United States or in non-tonal languages, for instance, pathways are going to be weakened, but other pathways are going to be strong. Okay? So memory is all about pathways, synapse, receptor sites throughout the brain, specific places in the brain, etc. We talked about hippocampus. Types of memory. So we have three main types of memory. First is the sensory memory. This is very, very brief, but large, extensive memory for sensory events. So for example, visual events is everything you open your eyes and see. Okay, that's your iconic memory actually. That's half a second, 1 second maximum. Okay, so everything you look at, you know for up to a second and it's gone, right? Then you have auditory stimuli. It's a little bit longer. It lasts a little longer, partly because there's not such a barrage of information in our ears. We'll talk a bit more about that in a minute. The second type is short-term memory. This is just the time you hold something in consciousness and are aware of it, you work on it. It's also called the working memory. It's called the second stage, but they're very much used synonymously. Working memory is what we have in our conscious awareness that we pay attention to, can't work on, right? And finally, long-term memory. This is very large and maybe practically infinite capacity and can store information relatively permanently. So it feels like our brains get full, but that's totally not the case. What happens is that the more we put in our brains, the more chaos happens in there. So when we have memories, they're like, you think of them, cognitive psychologists think of them as little nodes of information. And then you have a lot of pathways to that information. And to get to that piece of information and receive it, you need to follow some pathway, some key to it. So say we're talking about progress prediction. One pathway might be use the textbook. Another pathway might be my lecture. Another pathway might be this day. I listened to Jen and talked about it. Or you relate it to your own life, and when you talk your job with it, that's a more important thing because it's meaningful to you. So when we want to get to that offer prediction information, we need to find some sort of pathway to it on a huge mess of stuff that's going on in our head, right? But just because we can't access memory doesn't mean it's not pretty much permanently there. So now we're going to go into a little bit more depth about these different models. We're going to talk about the models and more in depth about the different types of memory. So like I said, cognitive revolution kind of coincided with computers. So we have the information processing model. And this is the idea that the processing of information from memory storage is very similar to the way a computer processes memory in 3 stages. Okay. The parallel distributed processing model. This assumes, again, it has a lot to do with computers, but the idea that the memory processes are assumed to take its place at the same time over a large network of neural connections versus 1, 2, 3, that's all at the same time in parallel, right? And another important model is the levels of processing model. And the idea here is that information that is more meaningful or deeply processed will be remembered better than information that is not. And I talked about this a little bit the other day when I talked about how it study that, right? Making information meaningful to you will mean you retain it for longer. It will be coded better with more connections to its pathways so that you will be able to retrieve it more easily. Okay, so let's look at the 3-stage process of memory. Let me see what memory we talked about here. So first we have sensory, we talked about it. Sensory memory says for what's coming in its senses, right? That initial encoding of light waves, sound waves, etc. Most of this information is lost immediately. We cannot pay attention to everything. I'm sitting here looking at this. I cannot pay attention to everything coming in at my eyes. I have to zero in and pay attention to specific things, selective attention, okay, which filters information to what we need to pay attention to. That takes out of all the huge sensory memory, takes just a few things and puts it in short-term memory, Okay, which is really pretty short unless you rehearse the information. So when you have stuff in your short-term or working memory and you either rehearse it, like repeating numbers, like if you're trying to memorize a little code in your phone so you can access the website, you repeat it over and over again. That's where it's maintenance or rehearsal memory, so maintenance rehearsal. Or elaborative rehearsal is if you bring something into short-term memory or working memory and you think about it. You put meaning to it. Think about how it connects the rest of your life. Okay, that's elaborative rehearsal. Makes it more likely to go into long-term memory, okay? So maintenance is keeping it in short-term memory. Elaborative makes it meaningful and explores consolidation and gives it long-term memory. Will stay there pretty much indefinitely. But then to think about it again, you have to bring it back into short-term memory. So for example, you have a midterm to do. You hopefully have a lot of the information from chapters 1 to 5 in long-term memory already. Probably you might do a little more studying before you do it. But to actually answer the questions on the exam, you have to take it out, retrieve information from long-term memory, put it in your working memory, so you can pay attention to it and answer the question. Make sense? Okay, so that's three-stage process of memory theory. We're going to go into a little bit more of sensory memory. Okay. Any questions so far? Yeah. Yeah, so that's called eidetic memory. We're actually going to talk about that in a minute. There are a few people whose iconic memory, and we're going to see, so their sentient memory lasts longer than a second. Okay, sometimes for up to 30 seconds or more. These are very special people. I don't know if we actually know how it works, but there are things, training to help this. And we're going to see next week, we're going to actually see a really cool video. There are people that do memory competitions, and they use all these techniques to memorize things. And mainly it's kind of a sort of elaboration. It's elaborate rather than maintenance. It's elaborate maintenance rehearsal to get these things to memory. But some people are just born. They can literally open their eyes and notice, like, turn around and say what everybody's wearing. Whereas, you know, I have to really focus and say, okay, we've got one Yosemite right here, and that's it. Okay, I can't remember. But I don't know. It's fascinating. That's a good question. Look up a TED Talk on that. Yeah, good question. Sensory memory, that very first stage of memory where some people have, you know, just very one in however a million people have more. Most of us have very little. This is just raw information from your senses. Over a very short period of time. Very short. Just enough for you to decide what to focus on and pay attention to. Okay. There's two types, basic, the iconic memory, that's the visual type. That's what I'm seeing when I look out at you guys. Lasts only a fraction of a second. It's everything that enters, it's everything in your visual field. So unless you have a visual defect, it's pretty darn big, right? But it's going to very quickly be pushed out as we fix our eyes, as we think about something, okay, or as we focus and narrow it down. That's called masking. Huge capacity, short duration. Okay. How do we know this? So we know this thing is terrific. He had an idea that it wasn't so much about how much, you know, it wasn't that we had very little memory, because what people thought is, oh, because we can only, if you get someone with 9 or 12 letters, and ask them, you know, for a couple seconds, just ask them to recall it, they're only going to remember 4 or 5. And that's just how people are, except for those very few who have photographic or identity, right? They're only going to memorize a few. And the idea was that the memory only lasted for 4 or 5, so they only were learning LHCy, for example. So Sperling thought that it's not so much that the capacity of learning, it's the duration of learning. So the way he tested this is he would show people, and we're going to see a video of this example. He would ask people to recall the letters only in the row of the tone they were. So they associated the high tone, medium tone, low tone with a different row, right? So one thing, the amount of letters recalled repeated in the time between presenting for a few milliseconds or a few seconds, between presenting the stimuli, which are the letters, and asking to recall, all ask people to repeat or to reproduce, right? Except those SBAS, the lower tone, they're going to remember those, or they're going to remember the higher ones. So it's not about what that memory is. It's because by the time you finish saying the first four letters, you've forgotten the rest. It will help if you go through a demonstration here so you can understand that. This showed that it was not about capacity, it was about duration, and it's very, very short. Let me go through the many steps required to get here. So this is going to be Sperling's task. When they do things like that, they put a plus so that the rest is being stimulus. Okay, so did anybody remember IEA? Let's try that again. So you have to remember only the one where the tone is. Remember DHJ. So you get it? You only try to reproduce what the tone corresponds to. Try one more time. That works. Okay, but in the real one, that's how Sperling did it. You have this special kind of machine, which I can't remember what it's called right now. Except for the numbers, the letters, oops, turn this off. The letters actually change between trials, right? You don't get the same IHB, DAD, whatever. They change every time, right? Okay, so that's how Sperling showed that it's really not about capacity, but about time. We can remember any of those lines if we're only asked to recall a specific line. But if we're asked to recall all of them, we can only remember 4 or 5 letters now. Okay. More on sensory memory. So there it is, eidetic memory, the rare ability to access a visual memory for 30 seconds or more, photographic memory, also known as photographic memory. Echoic memory. So that's the auditory part instead of iconic. Iconic is for visual, echoic is for auditory. And so the auditory part of this echoic memory, the capacity is less than iconic memory because there are only so many sound waves we can process at once. Our vision, we can see this whole room. Sound waves only so much we can process. However, it lasts longer than iconic memory. It lasts 2 to 4 seconds. So if you're trying to memorize something or learn something, the order of things, it's easier to do it if you're paying attention to sound. If you associate stimuli with sound tones, you will remember it longer than if it's just visual. You might have noticed, I noticed this playing video games, most definitely. Things will happen, you don't play things back. If I pay attention to the sound, I will do better. at most, things where realizing your response to things. Okay, so moving on from sensory memory. So we covered sensory memory. Now, the second step will be short-term memory, also called memory, working memory. And this is just the stage where you hold information for long enough to use it, okay, to focus on it, to do whatever you want to do with it, right? So, selective attention refers to that ability of all this stuff that's coming into our senses to actually focus on only one stimulus from amongst all the chaos, right? Really important. If we couldn't do that, we'd be stuck in chaos all the time. So selective attention is that picking out of the full sensory memory what we need to pay attention to and work on in short-term or working memory. Short-term memory lasts for 12 to 30 seconds without rehearsal. It's susceptible to interference. So for example, we're trying to memorize a code, so we can carry it over and put it somewhere, or a phone number. If the counting or the rehearsal is interrupted, we go back to the beginning, right? I'm sure you guys have noticed that. We tend to always want to start at the beginning of a phrase, okay, because we learn it in that order, and it's easily interfered with if not. So how do we know about short-term memory? The digit span test. And the digit span test, you have a series of numbers that are read, and then you're asked to repeat them or to write them down one way or the other. So, and this is all due to a famous paper in 1966, discovered the magic number of 7, that most people can hold 7 plus or minus 2 items in short-term memory at one time. So if it's digits or numbers, okay, most of us can really easily memorize 7, repeat them. Up to 8, 9, this is kind of like the math. He also talks about chunking. This allows us to remember more things. So we can only remember up to around 7 things. But if we make groups of items, then we can remember more. So for example, we want to, we know we can learn 7 numbers easily. If we have 14, we will learn them like 21, 14, 16, 33, rather than 2, 1, 1, 4, right? We naturally chunk things, and this enables us to remember far greater digit stands or whatever you're trying to memorize if we chunk them. I know we talked about that before too. So, you guys have something to write on? I'll give you a little digit span test. Okay. I'm going to read strings of numbers and then say go, and then you're going to write them down. Okay, ready? First trial. 6. Wait, I see people still looking at the same right there. So first trial. 6, 8, 2, 5. Go. Trial 2. 5, 7, 2, 1, 4. Go. Trial 3. 3, 5, 9, 7, 2, 1, go. Trial 4. 9, 2, 5, 4, 6, 3, 8, go. Trial 5. 2, 8, 3, 7, 1, 5, 6, 9, go. Seven, 3, 2, 4, 9, 6, 8, 5, 1. Go. Okay, now I'm going to show them to you. Okay, so the last one I did was 9, which is almost, this is not the math. I didn't do the number 2 final one because I got tired of reading them. So how many people got the first one? Or 4 digits? 5. I'm just going to go straight to our one. Anybody get this one? No, yeah, it's really hard to get 9. Most of these should have maxed out by around 9254. Okay. Well, actually, anywhere normal is from the second one to the last one with the average is 925, right? You can train yourself to recognize more, but really most of us can remember between 5 and 9, and 9 is pushing it. All right. Short-term memory. So, I already said this part. I don't know why I'm like a 2 slides. But something again, we combine things into meaningful units. So if we done that and you tried to memorize like 5-2 in chunks, you probably would have made it all the way to 10. Okay. Maintenance is just repeating it over and over and over again, which is probably what most of you guys were doing. Right. That's what I do. Moving on to long-term memory. Any questions on short-term memory? So we talked about sensory memory, iconic, and echoic, right? I've got short-term memory, chunking, and the magic number of 7. Short-term memory we basically use as working memory to work on the stuff that's in our conscious awareness. And then we have long-term memory. And that's the memory system in which information is kept more or less permanently. And one of the ways we do this is using elaborative rehearsal. Okay? This is making information meaningful in some way such that we can first encode it and later retrieve it. So the more meaningful, the more we can think about information such that it applies to our own life and to our existing knowledge, the easier it will be to retrieve it later when we need to recall it for some reason. So there's 2 basic types of long-term memory: declarative and non-declarative. Declarative memory is you're aware of it, you know that you're conscious of it. It's memory for facts, general knowledge, facts that have happened to you in general knowledge. And then we have non-declarative, also called procedural or implicit in memory. Okay, and this is memory for skills, physical stuff, habits, stuff that you're not really aware of all the little minutiae or mechanics of it, but you know it, like how to write a box. Okay, we know that you have procedural memory because we can see the way it manifests in conscious behavior. So implicit, also procedural and implicit memory are kind of interchangeably talked about, but procedural means like physical things, whereas implicit is like emotional association, habits. Classical conditioning results in consistent memory. So not using broad conscious awareness, but you can actually do it. Right. Okay. And anterograde amnesia. Now we saw this in the movie about HM. to learn how to draw that star. Amnesia does not affect procedural long-term memory. You can still learn how to ride a bike. Any amnesia, you're going to remember procedural stuff. Okay? If you wake up one day and you have to do it somewhere and you don't remember anything, you can have a dissociative fuse and not know how you got somewhere, but still remember who you are. But if you wake up one day and don't know anything, you probably still know how to ride a bike. And that would be retrograde amnesia. And retrograde is the opposite. You can't form new memories. It doesn't affect procedural long-term memory. So it's definitely separate. Procedural is different from semantic or declarative memories in general. So for example, this is a little test that people use for intelligence learning. Okay, you have to move all of the kids from A to B. You cannot put a larger disk on a smaller one, and you cannot lift more than one at a time. So basically, you can think about it. You go 1, 2, 1, and you can move back and forth until you get them all. So amnesia patients with inherited amnesia, they can't form new memories. They learn the procedure, but they couldn't remember the things they learned it, right? How do they know this? Because the first time we all learn to do this, right? By just picking up the ring. But the first time we do it, it's going to take us a while. But after you've done it a couple times, you know it. We do it really quickly. So people with amnesia got very quick at it, but they didn't know that they knew how to do it, right? So that's procedural memory. So that's non-declarative. What about declarative long-term memory? This is the stuff that you know and you know it, and you know why you know it and how you know it. You have semantic memory, which is general knowledge, facts. So hopefully you're busy putting everything I tell you into your semantic memory so you can regurgitate it on your exam and you can apply it to your life and figure out your grandmother and your dog and the neighbor next door, right? And read stuff in the news and understand what might be more likely to be true or false. That's semantic memory. Episodic memory is personal, specific information for your life story. Okay? What you do every day, what you do when you're a kid. So episodic story, the memory for your narrative, your personal life narrative. Both of these are explicit, you know them. What is non-declarative was implicit. Remember that? Making sense? So a lot of we talked about here episodic memory. When you sit down in the bar and tell someone that you think that all about yourself, you use the episodic memory. You're trying to analyze why Putin is invading, why to invade Ukraine, and you talk about history and the Cold War and the Soviet Union, you are exercising semantic memory. Right? Okay. Here is just a slide with some of the textbook to kind of show visually how long it takes. For studying if you need to. And people getting sleepy, so everybody stand up, move around. Let's take a 1 minute, 2 minute break where you stand and move around. I didn't have a nice discussion question, but I still think you guys need to move your bodies a bit. And let me still have 20 minutes. So let's try to get to the same place I did last time. So how is long-term memory organized? And it's supposed to be as we suppose it to be. It assumes to be organized in terms of related meanings and concepts. So a semantic network model assumes information is stored in the brain in a connected fashion. Okay, concepts that are related are stored physically close to each other than unrelated concepts. This is the idea that so you have a node as a memory. I wish I could draw on. I wonder what happens if I do this. I wonder if I. No, I don't think so. I think this does this side. Anyway, so you have a node, and the idea is they have their unique pathways to it. So things that are together are stored closer. And here's the next slide has an example, which is not my favorite. So here's what it might be conceptualized now. Okay, so animals, so everything is connected to it. Something like two birds that can be stored in similar places. Okay? Whereas kids start down, okay? And they're going to be all connected. So for example, you might have fish can't swim, and you might have whale can't swim, but whale is also a mammal, right? So it is very complex and probably not two-dimensional like this page. Okay, it's three-dimensional, it's actually in our brain, but the assumption is that the pathways between things that are commonly used or thought of together are going to be stronger and shorter, right? And this is important because how you access memories really depends on how they're stored. So I'm always talking to you about, how do you store memories about psychology if you can connect them to things that are already meaningful to you and easily accessed, it will be easier for you to access information about psychology. Okay, so memory retrieval. How do we get the memory, how do we get information out of long-term memory? Very important for all of us. So aids in remembering. What things help us remember? A retrieval skill is a stimulant for remembering, an acronym, method of Wilcox. And we're going to talk more about that on. So like every good boy does fine. That's for the staff, right? PEMDA, that's the order of operations for math, parentheses, exponent, multiplication, division, all that. These are ways to help us remember. Like order of operations is so important because we're actually applying that when we're having to solve a mathematical equation. So we use that acronym to remember how the order in which to go. Okay? Method of loci is when you associate things to remember with different rooms in your house, right? And then if you walk through your house, you also walk into, for example, areas of the brain. And we'll see some examples of that next week. Now, priming happens because when some kind of experience with one thing can improve later performance on a test or something like that. We saw a thing about priming, I think, a couple weeks ago. So here is a total specificity. It's simply that it's easier to retrieve memories when the place that you're trying to similarity of cues, so the place or the emotional state, are similar to when you retrieve it and when you actually encode it. So in other words, when testing occurs in the similar state that learning occurs in, you're more likely to be able to retrieve it. Does that make sense? It will in a minute if it doesn't. State-dependent learning, this is what they do. It really is that the memory formed during a particular physiological or psychological state will be easier to recall when in a similar state. So under this theory, you should always know if you're learning psychology in the classroom, it's better if you are actually are testing the classroom. That might be certainly true, but I still don't like inside to put that on my exam. But by this theory, it would always be better to take this exam than to learning material. I don't know. Here our finals in the same class as P. But like in my undergraduate institution, finals were in special places. They were never in the place where you got your lecture. I always wanted to tell them, hey, that's not a good idea, right? So, for example, actually they've done it more than once, but in one of the original studies, they had people learn words either inside or outside the water, on land or underwater, right, in the pool. So, look at this. If words are learned on land and recalled, tested on land, people remember more of them the most, okay? If they're learned underwater and then recalled underwater, they also remember what was really stressed. But the If they're learned on land and we hold underwater, they remember far fewer and it takes lots more. So if you're going to learn something underwater, you better make sure you test it underwater. Generally, this is the case. The only thing we really learn underwater is like scuba diving or something, and then you're also tested underwater. But anyway, we do a lot of research that seems kind of exotic, but the point is clear that it's better if you're in a similar environment. So types of recall, the types of retrieval from memory. One is recall. Recall is memory retrieval in which you have to pull the information from the memory without very many Q's or A's in your memory. This is like an essay test. Okay? So if you sat down and were asked, if I had for the test, I had to write an essay about the differences between operant and classical conditioning. And all you have is that, and you have to take care of all of that. That's an essay test. What happens when retrieval fails and you can't retrieve the long-term memory? You don't remember. Recall who failed, at least for a while. An example might be tip of the tongue phenomenon. You guys know what that is, right? And you know it, and you just don't, you can't pin it down. Okay, that's because you don't have the cue that's going to lead to that specific retrieval of the memory. So recall, like an essay test, when you have recall, we have a couple of phenomena happening. First is the serial condition effect. Okay, so this will happen, for example, if you ask recall, you have a list of vocabulary words and you are ready to test it on them. And the tendency of information at the beginning and end of the body of information to be remembered more accurately than the stuff in the middle. The primacy effect is that you remember the ones at the beginning better. That's because we reverse more. And the reason is that you remember things at the end better. Which may seem a little obvious, but here we have a graph of it. Okay, so here, a list of words, people are given a list of words to memorize and ask to use them. Write down every single word they remember from the list. They tell that they remember more that they were at the beginning because they have more rehearsal. They go over rehearsal in their mind, rehearsal. And then they remember there's a big gap, and then there's actually a fixed correct and keys with the words that were recent. So you remember the ones at the beginning and the end. More rehearsal means more in long-term memory. More recent means it's still in short-term memory. Does that make sense? So these are just things that tell us about how memory works. So what about the times when you learn something really quickly and you have a permanent, very vivid memory of it? Okay, automatic encoding is that sometimes information enters long-term memory with very little effort. Okay, that's learning. Like we talked about learning paperwork. It's one encounter where you get sick with food that you never want to eat again. Right? Car wreck and association with food and break. All sorts of things. Classical memory. So this is an experience that has really strong emotional associations, so it's encoded really quickly and it's remembered particularly clearly, especially under similar conditions to when it happened. That's a flashbulb memory. I'm sure most of us have experienced these too. Sometimes it's good things, sometimes it's a bad thing. Okay. Memory is very unreliable. More remembering is more like making up a story than reading one printed in a book. Why? Because of constructive processing. Okay, this is when you recall something, you have to bring it out along from there. When you do that, you're bringing it into your current working memory with everything that's going on around it. Okay, and then it's going to get re-encoded and put back into long-term memory. So when you put it back in that long-term memory, you've been thinking about it, working on it, you're changing it a little bit. And when it's encoded, it's slightly different from the way you took it out. Okay? All right, so the things you think on memory may be altered, revised, or influenced by newer information. Unless you are very careful, this will happen, especially happens with episodic memory. Okay? You're recalling the time that you went to Disneyland with your brother, and you guys are talking about it, and his memory of it in the beginning, when he recalls, it's going to be a little different from your memory of it, because you two people with different perspectives, right? Then you talk about it, and you do this time and time over years, and after 20 years, who knows what the truth is? Because you've adulterated each other's memory, and then your mother said you were telling you none of that really happened that way. Because her memory is really gone sideways, right? And this is constructive processing, which is a problem for like eyewitness testimony and stuff, which we'll talk about next week. More reasons for memory not being what it should be. Hindsight bias. That's the tendency to think that you already knew it. I knew it. The revision of older memories to achieve more information that you could have correctly predicted the outcome of an event. Okay, so I knew the stock market was going to crash. I knew we were going to have a drought. 5 years ago, I already knew about the drought. Okay? I knew Putin was going to invade Ukraine. That was obvious way back when Obama was in. I knew who was going to win the game. Monday morning quarterback. Right? Misinformation effect. This is just when misleading information is presented after the event to alter the memory. So this could be questioning when it comes to eyewitnesses, okay? Or suspects, right? Questioning, mess up their memory. This can happen with news, irresponsible news agencies altering things, misrepresenting the facts. So you don't know what's true and what's false. Right? You don't know where to look for it. Really problem with gaslighting. But we'll get to that at a different time. False memory syndrome, creation of inaccurate or false memories through the suggestion of others. Often while the person is under hypnosis, hypnosis is not necessary. People are gaslighting is just when you're led to believe false reality by believing it's crazy, by using others telling you what that's not happening. Okay? So you begin to fight without yourself. Right? It can happen in many situations. Okay? You can gaslight yourself and you're still for not for great enough, especially, right? Okay, but not all memories can be changed or created, right? Not all memories are subject to being manipulated and not every type of memory can become a false memory. It has to be close enough to the person's plausible reality for it to fit. Like you're never going to be able to convince me that, I wanted $1,000 yesterday and expensive. Okay, there are things that you're not going to be able to be tricked into believing. They have to be plausible. So what do you do to memorize words? This is just this slide is out of order. I noticed it this morning and I forgot to change it. So maintenance rehearsal, when you are asked to memorize the words, for example, we're talking about that field station, you repeat them over and over. Elaborate rehearsal. To repeat is when we add meaning, and that means it's going to stay in long-term memory longer and make it easier for you to recall. More on testing memory. So why are we talking? A lot of these things like did we ever use memorization and the words? Researchers do this to better understand memory. Okay. Serial learning. We talked about the recency and primacy effect. This is just when researchers give you a list of information and you have to learn it in order. Ordered recall. Free recall is ordered is like you have a list of words, you have to learn them in order. Free recall is just write down every single one of the words you remember, right? It's just methods for studying memory. Paired associate learning. You just have to learn things in pairs, and then the researcher will give you one of the pair and you have to call the other. Does that sound familiar? Anybody ever use this when they're learning things in their real life? Anybody study the foreign language? Yeah, okay. That's the way we memorize vocabulary often for foreign languages. We just pair the foreign language word with the English word or whatever our person did, maybe French, maybe Spanish. And then the idea is you recall the foreign language word by first recalling the native language word. However, So you know you really learn the language when you stop doing that, when the words just come to you in the other language. And then there's a lot of words that don't have pairs, right? So this is called paired associate learning, and we're almost done, so I better hurry up. So Ebbinghaus, he really started a lot of these memory studies. He made up nonsense syllables, so people wouldn't have an entire association or tendency to remember some better, and have people memorize it. He asked them to learn in the order with serial learning. That's how he discovered the serial position of that. And he talked about discovering what he called, or discovered it, I think, but the purpose of getting. And that's the idea that we forget very fast right after memorizing something, and then it kind of tapers off. So here's a graph of it. So here's the words to remember. So we have to memorize those nonsense syllables. And immediately, for everything, but within 20 minutes, they call them teaching, and then it's just kind of goes down and it's the purpose. Ebbinghaus, okay? Don't forget it. Okay, we're going to stop there. We're almost done. And next Monday, we are going to go on to improving forgetting. We're going to cover some ways to help learn things one way or the other. We're going to see some really cool memory stuff that kind of addresses so how can you learn to have a pretty good improve your memory, your iconic memory, and forgetting, which is also cool. So anyway, thank you. I hope I turned this back on. I did. Good. So stop recording. And I'll see everyone next week.